Wow, it's so lovely to see so many people here this evening. Thank you so much for coming. As Lily says, my name is Greer Jackson. I'm a freelance science and climate broadcast journalist. I'm probably best well known for my work on the BBC's flagship show on our warming world, that's The Climate Question. But I also have worked for The Guardian, The Economist, and the University of Cambridge as well. So I just wanted to set the scene a little bit ahead of COP30. And it was earmarked to be a pretty significant COP in many respects. You know, it was the first COP ever to be held in the Amazon, the rainforest, this thing that is so pinnacle and pivotal in our fight against climate change. It was also 10 years since the Paris Agreement, and the Paris Agreement was where we got some of the most ambitious, internationally agreed climate targets we've ever seen. A reminder that was to limit warming to ideally or less than 2 degrees Celsius, but ideally 1.5 degrees Celsius since pre-industrial time. So 10 years since that amazing agreement. It was also a COP of implementation. How do we ensure we meet those internationally agreed targets? Please do sit down, come and join us. No worries. And a lot of that was through submitting what's called NDCs, nationally determined contributions. Lots of lovely UN speak there, but essentially it means national climate plans. What were countries pledging to do in the lead up to 2035 to meet those targets? So that's where we were up to with COP30. It was going to be significant and it was going to be important. And all the while, I think it's worth noting that countries were being battered by extreme weather, some of it made worse or more likely because of climate change. And last year, in 2024, was the first year that we breached 1.5 degrees Celsius. So there has been a lot going on in the last year, not to mention all the politics that have been going on around the world. So really, our key questions for this event, hosted by the Conduit, but also the Climate Crisis Advisory Group, are: what did COP30 achieve? Did it move the needle? Did it get us any closer to meeting our internationally agreed targets? And what levers can be pulled if we want to meet those targets, if we want to avoid the worst effects of climate change? What can we all be doing, companies, businesses, individuals, but also our governments be doing if we want to avoid the worst effects of climate change? I'm sure you have lots of questions of your own, and we will be taking those at the end. But in the meantime, I want to introduce you to the people who will be answering those questions, our panel. Please come up and join me if I... Please give them a warm round of applause. Wonderful. So on the end, we have Professor Lorraine Whitmarsh. She's Director of the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations at the University of Bath, an environmental psychologist who specialises in perceptions and behaviours in relation to climate change, energy and transport, and you regularly advise the government and other organisations on low carbon behaviour, as well as being on the board for CCAG. Welcome, Lorraine. We also have Lord Nicholas Stern next to Lorraine. You're the I.G. Patel Professor of Economics and Government, Chairman of the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics. You were also Chief Economist at the World Bank in the early noughties, followed by being the UK Government Head of the UK Government Economic Service after that. If that wasn't enough, you're now author of another book, which is free to download, or there are copies afterwards for sale that I'm sure Nicholas will sign for you. It's called The Growth Story of the 21st Century. Remind us, Nicholas, what is the subtitle?
First, Nick will do fine. Nick will do fine. It's the Economics and Opportunity of Climate Action is the subtitle.
Brilliant.
But the in the title, The Growth Story.
The Growth Story.
Definite article matters.
Okay. Joyce Mendez, a migrant and social entrepreneur co-founding multiple organisations related to climate and youth justice, including, and I'm sorry, you're going to have to help me with the pronunciation of this, it's MoMA Vizier? Thank you. Environment Education Observatory, the Latin American Observatory of Geopolitics of Energy, and the Youth Collective of the Paraná Basin 3. Thank you. From the Cultivating Good Water Initiative, the latter of which was a recipient of the UN's Water Best Practice Award in 2015. Lots of interesting things here that we're going to be able to talk about. Right next to me is Wolfgang Blau, Global Managing Partner of Brunswick Sustainable Business Practice. You also co-founded the Oxford Climate Journalism Network, which trains journalists from more than 300 news organisations every single year to deepen their understanding of climate communication. So thank you very much for joining us. I think we'll just start very briefly, and we'll start with you, Lorraine, if that's okay. COP30, in a word, how would you analyse it and why?
I thought about saying disappointing, but I'll try and be optimistic, and I would say people-powered. And the reason is because in contrast to previous COPs over the last few years, we actually saw a much more visible presence of protest groups, of indigenous groups, of youth, of civil society organisations, and what came out also represented a little bit more the interests, I think, of wider society and recognise the diversity and importance of just transition.
Nick?
It was a modest step forward when it could have been a major step backwards, and I think that's important. It affirmed internationalism in the sense that only one country dropped out.
The US.
Yes, this is a knowledgeable audience. The first...
Just checking, there might be people at home.
Okay. The first 2 pages of the statement at the end were all about commitment to the Paris Agreement. If we tried to get the Paris Agreement now, we wouldn't. And so that affirmation, that unanimous affirmation of commitment to the Paris Agreement was itself very important. Now, not all countries interpret it the same way, not all countries affirm with the same strength, but they did all affirm that. So I think that was very important. Outside the agreement, you saw a lot of movement on initiatives and coalitions, and that's a significant step forward. So don't judge a COP just on the final statement. Judge it on what are the kinds of things that are happening there. The Tropical Forest Forever facility was launched, the Open Coalition on Carbon Markets, the working group led by Colombia and Netherlands on transition away from fossil fuels and so on, the working groups on forests. All those things matter, and also of particular significance was that the Brazilian government formed the Circle of Finance Ministers. And that's something that some of us have been working on for a very long time. It's normally the environment ministers that come to these meetings. Now, I love my environment ministers, but they don't run economies. And this is about fundamental economic change. It's about changing the way we do things. It's about big investment. So the fact that you've got the Circle of Finance Ministers called together by Brazilians with itself, signifying that we now see this, and that's the title of my book, it's a big growth story. An NDC is not simply a story about cutting carbon. An NDC is a story of how you intend to invest in your economy and what is the structure of your future growth.
Joyce, COP30 in a word, if I may.
Yeah, I will retake maybe the words of President Lula da Silva. He mentioned at the beginning of COP that will be the COP of the truth. And I'll say, I think, I put a couple of ideas, and I think there are 3 main truths that we realize. The first one, it was a COP of inclusion, or COP for people, but also a COP that shows how much, not just the debate, but the actions regarding climate justice. It was, across all the conversations and across all the actions during COP. The second one, ambition, or the lack of ambition as well. We saw a level, one of the lowest levels of NDCs, being delivered by many countries. And the third one is also how the COP processes are, as what you just mentioned right now, the Paris Agreement will not be able to take place with the multilateralism or lack of it at the moment, right? So it actually showed UNFCCC, or an institution kind of very fragile at the moment, in the way that obviously negotiations at last minute started, happening at closed doors, and even, essential actors like youth and indigenous peoples, we were sent out of their rooms, even though we were negotiators of our countries as well.
Wolfgang, your turn.
Maybe not in one word, but in 6 words, I would say could have been a lot worse. Because I remember half a year ago there were concerns that US Vice President J.D. Vance may want to hold a counter-COP and things like that. So in that sense, there was a sense of relief that multilateralism and this vehicle of multilateralism hasn't been destroyed. To keep the show on the road was one formulation I heard. Topically, the presence of trade, that something like a carbon border adjustment mechanism would be discussed, just shows how the energy transition is now in the center of the political debate, and this is about economics as much and even more than it has been about environmental action. The representation of indigenous peoples has, of course, been nowhere near enough, but higher than ever before, and it will be difficult to go back down from there. Geopolitically, I think there were high hopes that China would play a stronger role, also take more advantage of that power vacuum the US has left behind. That hasn't quite happened. What was also visible is just how weakened the EU currently is. It's quite something to threaten to walk away. If the transition was not included, then it wasn't included, and the EU still agreed. Overall, though, I came away more hopeful than despairing.
Okay, well that's promising. I suppose the bigger question here is how much did this move the needle on climate change? I'm thinking about the UN's emissions gap report that we had that took together those NDCs and looks at what we might be predicted to see in terms of temperature rise, and it was around 2.4 degrees Celsius. That was produced just ahead of COP. Do you think it moved the needle any further, Lorraine?
I mean, very slightly, I guess, but I think this is not where I look for optimism, which I can say more about, but I think like where I really see a lot more progress is at the local level, at city level. So, yeah, I mean, maybe a little bit.
Nick?
We have to come back to investment. This is all about investment. You don't run down the old until you've built the new. More than 90% of investment in power generation in the last year or two has been in renewables. So a lot is changing. We're not moving anywhere near fast enough, but if you look at the NDCs that were submitted, probably that will give you in 2035 a reduction relative to 2019 somewhere between 10 and 15%. Now it should be much bigger than that. But the projections going back to 2015, and I've been to all the COP since 2006 for my sins, and was very involved in Paris. But at the time of Paris, if you were projecting out, you would get probably 30% higher than 2019 for 2035. So the action has probably taken off, ballpark 40-something% of where we would otherwise have gone. Is that anywhere near enough? No. But it is an indication that we now have something to accelerate. It's not we have something to invent. In 2015, we were looking forward and saying, this would be a really good idea. But now, when you grapple with the details and look at the investment and see the challenges and the vested interests and so on, you recognize this is hard. We have to do much better, but we don't do much better by denying the progress that's taken place.
Yeah. Wolfgang?
I think what we saw once more is a COP is always good for a surprise. And the surprise was this time that this whole notion of a roadmap away from fossil fuels was not really on the agenda until President Lula included it in his speech. And also because so many governments came fairly empty-handed in terms of their domestic financial situation that they thankfully jumped on that. And there was this unexpected momentum. And that is actually a good thing. E3G, the think tank here in the UK that runs London Climate Week, published an analysis of these NDCs that you mentioned, Greya. And what they noticed is that 60% of these new climate targets contained very ambitious, the most ambitious targets ever on, for instance, ramping up renewables or reducing the share of coal and oil and gas in the electricity production. But only 2 or 3 contained anything that looked like a roadmap on how to get there. So it's really missing. And you see it in the corporate sector that governments have recognized it's nowhere enough for corporates to have shiny net zero targets. We need to see the plan for how they want to get there also within the next 3 to 5 years. So that this showed up and became a defining theme of this COP is a really good outcome.
I want to talk about levers before we move on, but just before we do, Wolfgang, what stood out to you in how this was communicated and the public narrative around it in the media?
Well, when you look at what makes a story newsworthy, no newsroom has a list of criteria, but as you know, of course, from being a journalist, there are learned behaviors and criteria. Is it recent? It's the news after all. That has been the challenge of climate change forever, is that it happened last year and will happen for the rest of our lives, no matter how old you are, so why run it today? That's when events come in. There's a big event. The event needs to be interesting, needs to have drama. The location needs to be interesting. So you saw a lot of coverage of this interesting location and these logistical problems that would be certain thankfully didn't quite take place. And then by the COP presidency taking many of the most controversial issues off the agenda right away, there was drama in will this poker game work out? It didn't quite work out for Correa del Lago. And then the interest died down a bit. So coverage was not as intensive as in years before. But it also needs to be added that the time it takes for major news organizations to just dismiss a COP as a failure is become ever shorter. It can now happen in the first 3 days of a COP. And that is somewhat lazy, I might say. It's the ultimate complexity reduction to say it was for nothing. Just like you see far too much coverage of that cover decision that is not legally binding, and very little coverage of the few negotiations that take place that are very technocratic but are legally binding because they are more detailed definitions of the Paris Agreement. So the coverage overall has not improved much, and the Reuters Institute at Oxford University has published this study that also news consumption of climate journalism has declined a bit. Having said that, I think there's, in proportion, too much coverage of the COPs and too little coverage of climate issues throughout the year, so I'm not too concerned about that.
Well, let's talk about levers. If we do want to meet our internationally agreed targets and avoid the worst effects of climate change, Joyce, what lever would you like to see pulled in order to accelerate climate solutions?
Yeah, well, I think that, it was following the flow, it was a COP of contrast, right? And I think that what we saw is that obviously there were a lot of things happening also in Brazil for that year. So I just want to contextualize you a little bit. So we had last year G20 presidency. This year was also BRICS presidency and COP30 presidency. So international policies in Brazil is that Brazil wants to be friends of everyone. And they, that's pretty much what is internationally. And it was nationally, we also had a lot of situations going on. And the first one was like, it was mentioned, about the roadmap to phase out fossil fuels, but at the same time, we have the Brazilian presidency leading the exploitation of oil in the Amazon still. So the question is, okay, and even days after the COP, because of the pressure of COP presidency on Brazilian presidency, it was announced that there will be an energy transition fund created out of the royalties of the fossil fuel exploitation in Brazil. But this can't be justifying the continuous exploitation of a government that says we're gonna explore until the last drop of oil out of the Amazon while you're hosting a COP. So I think for me it was difficult to see that leadership in that way. But in the other hand, we also had a lot of indigenous and civil society voices that highlighted not just beautiful words, but also actions that is being taken places, like the Munduruku peoples. So they took the COP in the first days, and they actually did a massive protest. And there's this iconic image of the president of COP30 with an indigenous baby, where they are discussing the future, also without the future generations. So I think for me, it's future generations' involvement during COP30 as well.
And just returning to what you were saying about exploiting oil, I guess a lot of the developing countries will say, well, we need to develop off the back of oil just like the rich Western countries have. So why shouldn't we do the same thing, right? That's the sort of narrative you hear around, the explanation you hear around that. But Nicholas, I really wanted to talk about the role of public finances. So much of the recent COPs have all been about how we can finance adaptation and resilience and mitigation in the climate sphere. So can we just talk about the importance of it and the direction that it's travelling and whether you think that's appropriate?
Yes.
I say appropriate, sorry, just to qualify that, given that, you know, we're in a time of austerity, lots of wars around the world, lots of competing issues.
Yeah. But could I just note on the back of what you just said about the exploitation of those resources, and two things very quickly. I was on a panel with the brilliant, now late Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Meles Zenawi, in the COP in 2011 in Durban in South Africa. And this was Africa Day, and we sat together thinking about finance for investment in Africa. And he said very clearly and strongly, it's not justice to foul the planet because other people have fouled it in the past. Emissions kill people. There's a right to development, but not a right to kill people. And development needs energy, but energy doesn't need carbon. And Meles was crystal clear on that in Africa back in 2011. And all the people who think that they're going to be developing are essentially betting against Paris, and betting against Paris is really dangerous because those won't be profitable investments if we pursue the Paris Agreement. And that links into what we have to do. We have to invest, and this is all about investment. It's investing in the new. It's investing in different ways of doing things. It's investing in a new structure of growth that's much better than the dirty, destructive models of the past. And we don't get to net zero with zero population. We don't get to net zero with zero output. We get to net zero by doing things very differently. And we have to invest a lot to get there. And that's where the finance comes in. Climate finance is not an abstract phenomenon. You give me the money and I'll decide what to do. That's never going to work that way. It's countries coming with their NDCs, which should be and increasingly are a program for a new form of growth, but is sustainable, resilient and inclusive. Adaptation, very big in this story. And saying these are the investments we have to make. In the metro systems, in the flood defences, in our forests, in restoring degraded land. Here's our programme of investment. Lots of it can be private sector, but that's not going to come unless the conditions are right. And it needs to be financed. So how do you finance it? Some of it, a lot of it will come through the private sector, but a lot of that finance has to be from the multilateral development banks, which can take risk in a way that the private sector cannot by itself, and a lot of it has to come from very low cost or zero cost capital, and that's where the new forms of finance that Laurence Toubiana was working on come in. That's where the SDRs, the special drawing rights from the IMF can come in. That's where the carbon markets can come in providing low cost, or in this case zero cost money. So you can't understand finance, which was your question, unless you say finance for what? It's finance for investment in this new form of growth. It's finance in the new ways of doing things which allow you to run down the old. It's financing more resilient economies. Resilient economies, fragile economies ain't going to grow because those blows are going to come. So that's where we have to think about finance. And I did with Vera Songwe and Amar Bhattacharya at the request of the Brazilian presidency a report which showed how that finance could work, and that's where the 1.3 trillion number of external finance comes from.
I want to talk a little bit more about private finance with you, Wolfgang. Typically developing countries say it's been very slow to come. There are lots of reasons for that around sort of debt and how that's increases more debt by increased interest rates. I'm just wondering, given that so much of the climate finance is pegged to come from the private sector, companies that presumably you are working with, what levers need to be pulled in order for them to take the jump and to invest in clean technologies, in the UK, but also in developing countries?
A major factor is the insurability of risks. And of course that is something that Professor Stern knows so much more about, how to de-risk these investments through blended finance and increasingly also through blended insurance. As soon as there are state entities involved, such as national pension funds, that is where the political mandate comes into play. And we spoke earlier before we came out here about that question whether there is enough basic scientific literacy established. And I think we came to the agreement that it isn't, that there are major pieces missing. One, of course, is the drastic difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees warming, but when it comes to non-domestic climate finance, there's also the fact that it is mostly still being misunderstood as developmental aid and not as something that we do in our own interest. And the piece of science that is missing there is that no matter where in the world you emit 1 megaton or kiloton of CO2, it takes between weeks and months, maybe a year or a little more, for that emission to be in this room. It is quite striking how quickly greenhouse gas emissions disperse and diffuse globally. So it almost doesn't matter where in the world we fight emissions or finance the transition away from fossil fuel energy production, for instance, or also transportation, other sources of emissions, because it is in our own security interest. It is not only an act of compassion. Of course, ideally there are co-benefits economically, socially, and what have you. But it is in our own interest. So that is a narrative piece that is missing, because most, speaking of blended finance, contain some sort of taxpayer-supported element.
Lorraine, I feel like there's often a big sort of balance between systemic change, what governments are doing, versus what individuals can do. Where do you see the key levers there in ensuring that individuals have an easy choice, if you like, a cheap choice, which is ultimately the green choice?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't see it as a sort of dualism, system change versus individual change. I think that they're both like interlinked, essentially, because if you think about how societies change, it is about the individuals collectively acting in different ways to steer that change. And conversely, individuals, of course, are very constrained by the system. So this is a kind of a tension. But I mean, I think what we often say is that absolutely technological change, innovation and investment is a critical part of what we need to reach net zero and adapt to climate change. But we need people power. We need to be thinking about the behavioural elements, the behaviour change side of things. If you look at what we need to reach net zero in this country, most of the measures needed will require behaviour change of some kind or another. Some of that is about adopting green technologies like electric vehicles and heat pumps, but some of it is about wider lifestyle change, changing diets, reducing and changing the way we use energy and resources, being less wasteful, conserving things. And there are huge co-benefits to that. There are well-being benefits and equity benefits of thinking about it in the sense of having a fair consumption space. So it's about reducing overconsumption at the same time as thinking about increasing underconsumption in developing parts of the world. So I think drawing attention to the behavioural change side of things, and particularly on the demand side, so not only focusing on moving away from fossil fuels, absolutely critical, but also thinking about how we use energy and resources, the demand side of things.
I mean, that's more challenging politically, though, isn't it, to try and enable?
Very much so, which is probably why we don't see very much progress on that side. But it is about challenging the narrative that that by changing behaviour and reducing consumption, we are reducing quality of life for people, because the evidence suggests the opposite is actually true. There are huge well-being benefits. The IPCC has evidenced this. There are huge well-being benefits of making those demand-side changes where we reduce overconsumption and live our lives in more efficient ways. We benefit in terms of clean air and healthier lifestyles and biodiversity and so many other things. So it is about emphasising those wider societal benefits that come with those changes, and that actually it's not about reducing quality of life, and it's about pointing out that the public are broadly on board with a lot of those changes. They do want more action, so it's not a vote loser in that sense.
Yeah, sure, I understand. And I know the CCAG put out a report on methane that showed that it could play a critical role in reducing short-term temperatures. I think it was 0.3 degrees Celsius saving by 2040s. And we all know that farming, especially beef, ruminants like lamb and goat, they burn up a lot of this methane. And that does seem to be an area that's very hard to tackle. People eat a lot at home where there isn't that sort of social pressure to eat less meat. So how do you see that playing out in a world where we want to meet our internationally agreed targets?
Yeah, absolutely. Part of the way that we need to address the methane challenge are about sort of novel technologies and some of those innovations, but also it's about farmers doing things in different ways and embracing regenerative farming and all the sorts of innovations that on the kind of supply side, but also it is about consumers thinking about diets differently, so reducing the amount of red meat and dairy that they consume, and reducing food waste as well. And there are some really clear, again, co-benefits there, so huge health co-benefits from reducing particularly red and processed meat consumption. So it reduces the risk of cancers and various other lifestyle diseases. But also, food waste, we can reduce bills at a time where people are suffering with cost of living crisis. So it is about, I think, reframing in terms of those wider benefits. And when we've done work in terms of, for example, the Climate Assembly, the UK Climate Assembly, we actually found that most people are very supportive of the idea of eating less meat and dairy, not necessarily cutting it out altogether, but actually just making the alternatives more available and cheaper is a sort of an important condition of that.
I want to turn to our sort of final big question, and given that we are living in this quite politically divergent narrative around climate, we've mentioned the US very briefly, and we're seeing it in the UK too. I'm wondering, is living in a fractured world, politically and polarised, how big an impact that's going to be having on climate? And I suppose the really big question is a coalition of the willing enough? Or do we need consensus? Do we need global consensus? Joyce, would you like to take that first?
Yeah, I mean, during the negotiations, it was interesting because, I mean, even that concept of consensus, during the final negotiations, it was portrayed, right? I mean, and many people were like, why Colombia have to open their mouth at last minute? And, that's why they have to stop negotiations because, we weren't really agree with, specifically, not having the word fossil fuels phase out in the final draft, right? Although there were other big wins, especially for civil society in Latin America that we saw during this consensus, which was the mention of indigenous and African descendant people as fundamentals, as they're no less fundamental for climate action and climate justice. But I think there is also another debate that I hear a lot, especially with young negotiators from several global south countries, and it was about sovereignty. They were like, okay, we have this, NDCs, and we have the Paris Agreement, but implementation needs to be in the terms that every country feels the best because it's climate sovereignty. But in the other hand, obviously, COP is a political process. So if we're having global consensus, then we need to also have it at the level of implementation, right? And in Brazil, we have a big challenge, and in Latin America, I see because, Colombia came with this roadmap specifically for, transition away from fossil fuels, and they have declared during COP that they will be the first country to stop oil exploitation in their share of the Amazon, in their part of the Amazon. So we were expecting other countries or Pan-Amazonian countries to follow as well these commitments with clear roadmap, right? And in the other hand, I also think that what we realize as well, not just during the negotiations, but also after, especially in terms of what was left for civil society after COP, right? Not just the implementation of, climate agreements, but also minimum of climate justice, impacts, especially in the case of Amazon and of Belém. And it was that during the protesting, I'm just mentioning several times because it was very impacting as well. The COP30 presidency had to say, okay, we're going to recognize several indigenous lands after that protesting. So it was a big announcement. We're going to recognize 12 indigenous territories, right? And after COP30 finalized, it's being diffused in the news and in bureaucracies. And even with they discovered several GPS trackers in several indigenous delegations. So we still have this panorama, social panorama, where Brazil and Colombia are the most dangerous places for indigenous and land defenders to be speaking publicly, even though having a COP30, right? So all what we see and what we see from now in terms of implementation is not just the climate implementation at a national level, but in the intercultural level, in the level of how these policies will also help us to overcome social inequalities, because my continent is one of the most unequal of the world, but also to tackle climate racism and climate justice in our territories. That's how. And then know-how we're going to find out as well, because at least we have a perspective, right? The document wasn't perfect, but it showed a lot of political will, and it showed kind of the status of the world at the moment. But I mean, there is a lot of work left to do for us as well, civil society.
Wolfgang, I could see you nodding along to that. What are your thoughts? Is coalition of the willing enough, or do we need a global consensus?
You know, I thought about your question and I realized I don't understand it, because I thought, what does a global consensus look like, and what are the odds of that? Of course, there's a misunderstanding around this entire UNFCCC process. The people who are most vocal in articulating their frustration with it somehow think it's the shortcoming of the UNFCCC that there is no central decision-making body. I'm not sure anyone would want a world government that can push through these decisions. So coming to consensus and slowly moving forward is the best we got. In that sense, yes, we need it. And who brought that, to my understanding, more than anyone else, was a poet, a writer, Kim Stanley Robinson, who wrote The Ministry of the Future, that contains this description of a heat wave in India, of which President Obama said it changed his mind on climate change. And he and I were sitting in Glasgow on a panel together, and I said to him, how do you make sense of this multitude of negotiation tracks and events? And I feel so confused and overwhelmed here. And he said, you know, the way how you have to look at this is humanity's greatest collective exercise in science fiction writing. What we're doing here is we're jointly negotiating different versions of the future. And then the power struggle is to pretend that it is legally binding while we all know it isn't. And that is how the caravan moves forward. And I think he has a point.
Nick?
It's critical that we understand that we have to move very quickly. The next 15 or 20 years could be absolutely decisive. The infrastructure that India will have in 2047, just 2 decades away, the 100th anniversary of independence, well over half of that infrastructure will be built between now and then. And that's India. In other countries, that statement is still stronger. So this next 20 years, particularly in those countries which are going to grow faster than the others, and it's good that they do, the emerging markets and developing economies, the investment that takes place there is absolutely critical. This is about metros. It's about restoring degraded land. It's about investing in our forests. It's about building sustainable, resilient, and inclusive growth that really reduces poverty quickly across the board in a way that can be sustained, because it's the poor people who are hit hardest and earliest by the impacts of climate change. So that means it's about investment and behavior. It's not about reducing consumption or reducing production. It's about doing things in very different ways, including much less waste. That's a very big part of the story. But if we try to tell people that it's all about, you know, giving up growth for the environment, it's all about cutting this and it's cutting that, we're not going to succeed. It's not going to work. And it's actually a misstatement of the problem. The challenge now is to invest in very different ways from the past, to behave in different ways from the past. And it's very important that that is seen as enormously attractive, because it is. It's much better than the dirty, destructive models of the past. We kill 5 to 10 million people a year in the world from air pollution. And in a number of deaths in the world that is a little bit above 50 million. 5 to 10 million in ballpark 50 is huge. And that doesn't count the people we maim. Maiming people is very bad for productivity. This is a point that you were making. This is a very attractive story of doing things in different ways, not wasting. Well, efficiency, improving efficiency, not just energy efficiency, across the board, resource efficiency, including through circular economy and so on. Improving efficiency improves productivity, improves growth. But it's very different from the dirty, destructive models of the past. You get there only through investment. You have to create the conditions for investment. People won't produce clean energy or clean electricity if they're not confident that they can sell it. They won't embark on investments unless they're confident they can get things done reasonably quickly. So that's the story, and it's an enormously attractive story. And we can't be persuasive on this unless we do two things. Show that that urgency is desperate. You know, unless we really move quickly in the next 15 or 20 years, we're heading for 2.5 and 3, and we now know how deeply dangerous that is. Every time you look at the science, it looks worse. And at the same time, and here we have to do a good job as well. I try, others of people are trying to show that this new story of growth is much more attractive than the models of the past. That it does tackle poverty, it does give us better health, it does give us better lives. And that is a story that is accurate, and you need examples, you need people to show it can happen. You don't need consensus. You need lots of people acting and showing it happens, and that will pull other people along.
Lorraine, you're nodding along.
Yeah, I completely agree, and this is why I would say where I see the most hope and optimism is at the local level. It's cities are just getting on and just delivering ambitious climate action because they can see and experience these co-benefits so directly. So cleaner, public transport, active transport, because they need cleaner air, because they want to reduce congestion, they want safer streets for their children. All of these things are very tangible benefits, and you have the local population supporting these initiatives because they directly benefit. And so you don't need, although the political consensus on climate change factoring is not ideal, actually cities are just getting on and doing lots of good things anyway.
You all make it sound very easy, but obviously
none of us
not easy.
No, that's wrong. That's wrong. None of us make it sound easy.
Well, sorry, you say it's a compelling story, and yet it is not a story that everyone is on board with. What do you see, Nick, as the barriers that need to be lifted in order to make that a compelling story for all?
We know that the clean is cheaper than the dirty across without carbon price. I mean, shame on us, but even without carbon price, the clean is cheaper than the dirty across at least 30% of emissions. Power sector and vehicles, electric vehicles. People have to see that. Unless this government gets, you can get fed up with people telling you that the clean is cheaper than the dirty. You've got to see it. And unless this government gets the price of electricity down substantially before the next election, then we will be in deep trouble and people will react against it. You have to show, you have to see. And that's the stage we're in. At the time of Paris, it was, this is the way we should go. Now we're going, and people have to see the benefits that we're trying to set out. And they can, but it needs good policy to make it happen. It needs investment to make it happen. This ain't easy, but it's perfectly possible.
It strikes me that what we're talking about is communicating how severe the crisis is, but packaging that in a way that is palatable.
It's not just comms. This is showing that it happens.
Broader, but I mean, so much of this is also about individual actions, as Lorraine has been describing, right? And so I put a question to you, Wolfgang, given how much you've researched in this area, what is a way to engage people in this topic when it is actively a topic that people switch off from and try and avoid in the news avoidance cycle?
Yeah, so in recent months, just as we realize all climate finance is insufficient, the COP process is insufficient, things are happening, but they're not happening fast enough, and I went back to some of these commonly held beliefs around climate communication, and I thought, what are the odds that what we thought works is insufficient as well? And the three typical rules of climate communication currently are focus on the economic upside of climate action for all the obvious reasons. That's also fueled by what is happening in the US, where corporates are under pressure by Republican general attorneys who say, if we find you invest money into anything that doesn't directly benefit your shareholders, you're in violation of your fiduciary duty. So those with the largest communications budgets in the world, some of these companies are worth more than the entire London Stock Exchange, such as NVIDIA, and they shape our perception of what climate communication should look like. They speak about the economic upside. And yet we see quite a lot of research, I'm sure, Lorraine, you have seen it too, that says that that is not the strongest motivator for voters or consumers or individuals, where there's this one study by an outfit called Potential Energy, where they saw the promise of job growth or of economic growth as the baseline. They measured that, and then they saw that the promise of greater health benefits, to your point, Nick, about air quality, is 5 times as strong as a motivator. And then the care for future generations is 12 times as strong. But you wouldn't hear it from a government right now that has to talk to investors and bankers and foreign direct investors. So first one is to say, do not underestimate other motivations. And I was reminded of that, Nick, when you presented your book. And in your speech at the LSE, you mentioned your granddaughter. And that was a moment where the entire room took a deep breath, because we know. So to lean on that more. The second belief is always be positive. Do not come across as a doom monger or as a fear monger, or people will switch off. Yes, that is true. We all know that's not a topic you want to raise at a dinner party. It's still a social taboo when you really want to speak about the difference between 1.5 and 2. However, when we did research at every publication I ever worked for, when we asked, what would you like to read, watch, hear more on climate change, people say, what can I do? Number one question, what can I do? And we didn't like that finding, because we thought, well, we don't want to overemphasize the personal carbon footprint with all the manipulation that goes hand in hand with, until we understood it is a coping mechanism we need to provide people with for them to be able to look into the abyss of some of the more threatening information. So I would say Michael Mann, the climate scientist, says always convey agency and urgency together. If you only convey the urgency, people switch off. If you only convey the agency, you're always at risk of greenwashing and of understating the size of the challenge. And then the third, and that is more the theory of change of journalism, is that we think the strongest antidote to climate disinformation, which is of course rampant and growing, are well-sourced and vetted facts and figures. And that is true. And the theory of change in most newsrooms is that if we only throw enough facts and figures at people, somehow a patina of understanding will stick, and that will lead to a change in values, and that will lead to a change in behavior, whether it's nutrition or travel or what have you. And yet, Lorraine knows so much more about that than I do, is not how behavioral change happens. It mostly happens through us observing others, whether that's individuals, governments, or corporations, change their behavior. So that's a long answer to your what works. I think the first step is we need to go back to the drawing board and really question some of these assumptions and be more courageous in appealing to what Amitav Ghosh once said. He said the climate crisis is a crisis of our imagination. Yeah. And we're really lacking the imagination in both directions, how bad things can become very soon and will if we don't change, but also how much better they could become, we also struggle with. You know, we can really not imagine a thing such as energy abundance, even at a time when in this country we have thrown enough electricity away last year to power all Scottish households for an entire year, 8.3 terawatt hours, because we didn't have the storage or the power lines to bring it to places where it would have been needed. So effectively, we are already in the early days of energy abundance. 3 states in Australia are planning to give away solar power for free for 3 hours a day. So I would appeal to our imagination, and then to come to the end of my long-winded answer, Greya, is I think we need to lean more on other actors in society to communicate climate risks and climate opportunities. And when you think who stretches our imagination, who really does that? It's the arts, it's artists, it's gaming companies, it's poets, it's theater plays.
Gary Lineker.
Pardon me?
And people like Gary Lineker,
yeah,
sports people.
Yeah, absolutely. And because they come across as non-political also makes it much more palatable. And so that is where I would appeal more, especially in a country such as the UK that over-indexes cultural exports compared to pretty much any other place on the planet, is to really think hard and support working groups like at BAFTA, Albert, and they exist, they're gaming company coalitions, and not just see them as decorum to the real conversation, but as absolutely vital to us embracing the challenge and the opportunity.
We are going to turn to questions now from you. If you can keep them short, that would be great. And also just let us know who you would like on the panel to answer the question.
Thank you very much. That was an excellent discussion. Really, really enjoyed it. I'm Sagarika. I'm at somewhere called the Climate Champions and worked on the COP30 action agenda. So I'm a bit sneaky. I've got 2 questions, but you can choose one if you want. The first is for you, Nick. It was touched on a little bit. What motivated you to write the book? Like, why now? I mean, you've written so much. It's so well read, what you write. And by the way, I'm on page 22 of the book. It is fantastic. It's full of rationality and ideas. And then the second thing is for you, Wolfgang. You've touched on it actually quite a bit, but I just want to go a bit deeper. For this community that's here at the Conduit Club, it may or may not be possible to have a collective strategy on climate disinformation. You've given a bit of guidance, but what do you think, again, going back to agency, this community could collectively do on climate disinformation, beyond obviously third-party references, thinking about messengers? Thank you.
Thank you very much. The reason I wrote it was really picking up on what Wolfgang and really all of us have been saying, is that we don't win this one unless we show that there's a really exciting future and describe it and tackle. And what I've tried to do, if you make it to the end of the book, is to show how you do it. And we've had a lot of we must do it. And it's right, but we need more of, if we do it, it looks really attractive and really exciting. It's just much more healthy, and cities where you can't move and breathe are no cities to live in. To bring up a child in Delhi is to give a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old 20 cigarettes a day. It's a much better way of doing things. So to get that argument across, that it is the growth story of the 21st century, very different from the growth story that went before. It's very attractive. And further, here is where it's happening, here is how we do it, here is how we overcome the obstacles. Because when we were sitting in Paris, and I still remember that December day and how excited we all were, and hugging each other, and Chez Genois hugging, and we were all together, and how wonderful it was. It was looking forward. Now we're actually in the middle of trying to make it happen. To show that it's really attractive, to show it can be done, to show how you do it, how you overcome the obstacles, is a critical part of actually making it happen. And it's the other stuff that we have to do as well. You have to show the urgency, but this is all about the agency. But if I had one word on the communication side, because we need to show the action, show it's attractive, but at the same time we have to do the comms. And when I started on the Stern Review 20 years ago now, I spoke to a dear friend, Danny Kahneman, who a wonderful psychologist, economist who won the Nobel Prize in economics, and one of the most pessimistic people I've ever met. And he said, I understand what you're saying, Nick. I know you're going to write down all this economic stuff, but nobody will believe it. That's not the way it works. And then right at the end of the conversation, when I was getting really depressed, he said, look, what matters more than anything else in the communication is who is saying it. And here was an Israeli sitting in Princeton talking to an economist sitting in London, and what he was telling me was you need the Pope, you need you need the mullahs, you need the rabbis, and you need everybody. You need the people in the temple. You need that kind of religious leadership. You need the David Attenboroughs. You need the Gary Linekers. You need the people who have some kind of trust, and that is a big part of the story. But they will pick things up very well. But academics have their job too, which is to try to set out and understand how it can all happen.
Very quickly, and of course I don't have a conclusive answer, but I think institutionally it needs more resource. It's surprising how few outfits there are or chairs of professors around the world on climate communication. I think less than 10, and I'm tracking that space now since many years. My hope is that at the new sustainability school that there will be a significant investment.
We just started a global school of sustainability at the LSE, and Wolfgang's going to endow a chair in climate communication.
Thank you. So that was the payload of my statement. But I wanted to come to another point, which is inoculation. Don't just chase the disinformation. Think about those who have not been reached by it yet. And there's a lot to learn from COVID communication in the past, where research has been done at the USC, at the Annenberg School of Communication in Philadelphia, where they looked at about 100 disinformation memes, and they said, we can't chase every single one of them. Which ones are those that we must win? And one of them was the belief that as soon as you have an mRNA vaccination, it will change your DNA. And they realized that once people start believing that, they're kind of lost. So that's the one they have to fight. And then they went one step further about the inoculation. What are the facts and figures that need to be established? And there are groups in this country who say, very intelligent, educated people who say we are on net zero, to use the word we all managed not to use tonight, which is really good. We are on net zero where we have been on the Brexit referendum 2 years prior, i.e. in 2014. And we need to do all the things now equivalent to that we wish we would have done in 2016, looking back to 2014. And that is much more about inoculating those parts of the population of which you can calculate that they're susceptible to energy disinformation or climate disinformation. And then lastly, I think omission is as potent as disinformation. So when I look, for instance, at signs of activism in newsrooms, I am as interested in what is not being covered at all as I'm looking at what is being covered and may contain disinformation.
Fantastic, thank you.
Hi, we're here from Australia. We came for the Resilience Conference that was hosted here for the last couple of days. I'm the CEO of the City of Sydney and have been for 20 years, and we've had 5 elections, and I say to the Lord Mayor all the time, no one goes out on election day, Lord Mayor, and says, gee, the emissions are down today. But what they do say is, gee, that light rail is fantastic. I'm so glad we did it. Isn't it wonderful to see all the trees, the cycleways are there? It was lovely to hear you acknowledge the role of cities. But my question is, and statement is that we're still not really included in the conversation. So cities are really not in the room when these discussions are being had at the COPs. We have an awful lot to offer, and we also bring that license to operate, but we are not actually really included, nor are Indigenous people and other people actually really included. So my question is, how are you going to bring us into the room? Because we do have so much to offer, and we do bring the population. We bring that license to operate.
Well, just very quickly, I only know that during the first Trump presidency, the UNFCCC very much focused on cities, and there's this organization you may know, America's All In, that is a large alliance of cities that works with the C40 and also ICLEI. So that is a renewed effort that is going on right now, is to at least work with American states and with American cities to keep them involved in the UNFCCC process. But other than that, you're right, there's very little formal representation.
I think the cities and your presence and what you're doing are making their own case, and I think they should be brought much more into the UNFCCC, but I suspect that's not the big deal. The big deal is the cities standing up and doing their things and letting people understand what's happening. And I mentioned Delhi before. If the people of Delhi say we cannot go on poisoning our children and indeed ourselves, as we are doing, look at Sydney, look at how they do it. These are the kinds of examples, it seems to me, that you can bring to the table and take forward. So my instincts are saying, look, I mean, it's fine if you have more representation at UNFCCC, but that's probably not the big deal. The big deal is what you do, how you share it with others, how you communicate it. And one of the stories there, and I worked for 10 years for multilateral development banks, first as chief economist of the European Bank Reconstruction, and then secondly as chief economist of the World Bank. Getting those institutions to lend much more to cities, to build the metros, to build the cycle lanes, and to build the light transport, to make the community energy usage much more efficient. I think that could be a big part of the story as well. So my advice in one sentence is lead the charge, and you probably are.
Maybe I just would like to compliment on the spirit of COP30. The main word that was used to bring people was mutirão. And mutirão comes from the Guarani word minga, which means to bring people together. So the mutirão, what it means to us when we call a mutirão or a minga of people is to do a collective good. It can be a volunteering effort, can be a community effort, and make, something that brings to my mind the question of cities. It is a case that is being studied a lot in adaptation, and it is the city of Medellin in Colombia. So the city of Medellin had a lot of, if you hear Medellin, which how people pronounce it, had a lot of history, unfortunately, on the 80s, late 80s or 90s in Colombia, where big narco traffic took place. And after this period, there was a huge effort to employ youth and employ people in order to make public gardens and cultivate trees. And it sounds really simple, but the city, compared to other cities in Colombia, it actually decreased the temperature of 1 degree Celsius. It sounds not much, but it is. So actually the thermic sensation on Medellin is really pleasant. It's allowing people to have jobs, but it's a reference worldwide. And that's what we want it to be, from this narco-traffic city, from a climate-leading society, example. So as probably what Nicholas was mentioning is setting the example. Nobody, it was people in Medellin who decided to take the lead. It was public policies as well. So I think that's the best way. And it's not being, in the UNFCCC processes, there is not a delegation from Medellin. But nowadays it has changed the difference and change people's lives. So I think this is what it is like, led by example actually, and by the spirit of mutirão.
I'm afraid that takes us right up to 7:30, so I'm afraid we can't take any more questions. I'm so sorry, but please do join me in thanking our wonderful panel this evening. And one reminder, Nick has some copies of his book. If you would like to buy it, I'm sure he will sign it for you, and you can also download it free online as well. That's it. Thank you very much, everyone.